Hey y'all, welcome back to Love, Sweat, and Tears Ingredients for Transformative Campus Leadership. Today we have Martin Silverman on. He was a principal for, I think, 30 years, is what he said, and just recently retired and is kind of moving into that coaching space because, man, he's got some great skills and stories. He talks about some of the failures he experienced and how he grew from them. And I just love the skills and resources he has, and he's just great to listen to. I know y'all will enjoy it. Marty, it's so great to have you on Love, Sweat, and Tears. I would like to start just by you telling us a little bit about yourself, where you are right now, what you're doing.
Marty Silverman. I am a very recently repurposed. You have a friend that uses that word, and I think I'm going to use that. Maybe upcycled. We'll see which one of those works best. Elementary principal here in beautiful San Antonio, Texas. Um, I am I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. Definitely a New Yorker. All my family's still up there, and still one of my favorite places to go. But I've been in Texas my whole career. I just finished my 40th year in Texas public education. Yeah, I moved here right out of college and started teaching in Houston ISD. I worked in San Antonio ISD, Medina Valley ISD. And for the last 25 years, I've been in Judson ISD here in San Antonio. Um, I'm a father, husband, grandfather of four with two on the way, two grandkids coming. And the oldest of which right now is three. So lots of little kids
So
and
many
babies.
littles,
And yeah, so a
yeah.
lot of fun um, spending time with some very little people.
And are all your kids and grandkids in the San Antonio
They
area?
are.
Do you
They're
get to
all
see them
within
often?
about 15 minutes. So,
Oh my
yeah, it's really
gosh,
nice.
that's the
Really nice. Oh,
life.
for sure. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh. So tell me about growing up in Brooklyn, what school was like for you. What were you like as a student?
Yeah. So I grew up, my parents were children of immigrants, right? All four of my grandparents, immigrated uh, back in the early 1900s, and my parents were the first generation born here. So we grew up. We grew up. For lack of a better word, we grew up poor. I lived in it when I was born. We lived in a housing project in Brooklyn. We lived there till I was 7 years old. My parents never owned a home. We rented apartments my whole life growing up, and it was a actually kind of a great place to grow up at a great time. Although the time in New York, it was kind of a tumultuous time, but for a kid, especially the youngest kid of four and the only boy, it was a very good place to grow up. My dad did not graduate high school, worked in a factory and in the garment district in Manhattan. My mother she had a high school diploma with like a what now would be considered a CTE. Like, it wasn't, a college bound program. It was a secretarial kind of program. And she worked when I started school. She started working, and she was a secretary. She ended up working for the City of New York Police Department and worked for them for many years. And that's where she retired from. So working class people who, like I said, didn't have home ownership and all that. And so I was one of I'll call it a crowning achievement, right, of my childhood is
Yeah.
because I am the age I am. I was the first group of kids that went through Head Start and pre-K in New York when that was established back in 1966. And so I was a product of pre-K, and that was brand new. It started the year I was four, and so I got to, having grown up where I grew up, the part of town I grew up in, that was a focus, was working with low income families, and so there I was that guy.
Interesting. So what was it in your life that made you want to pursue higher education?
So, you hear a lot of times about people talking about their families pushing college, like, families that said, you're going to go to college. And I think the expectation, growing up in the 60s and mostly 70s, um, that, upward mobility was seen to be a thing. That was a thing. Now, so, my parents not being formally educated were still pretty educated people in that reading was a big thing. There were books all over the house. They, read newspapers. Um, they they were readers. Okay, and so that model was definitely imprinted early, and so it was a really, um, I always felt like the expectation was that poor lower middle class kids, you just go to college. It was, I don't remember it ever being like formally pushed, but it was certainly, um it was certainly a thing that was seen to be a good thing. And so, yeah. And my, being the youngest, my sisters all went to college. My oldest sister actually didn't finish college till much later, but the two that were right ahead of me, went, they just did the 4 year thing right out of high school, went to college and did that. And so the model was definitely there to do it. I was the only one of us that went away to college. I didn't go to college in Brooklyn like my sisters did. I went to a college in upstate New York, and had kind of like that adventure, but it was definitely seen as a, and it was very accessible and available. College was easy. Now, my parents couldn't help navigate it. A lot of it was done on my own and through, whatever resources I could kind of find myself, or through, through the high school I went to. And I went to a magnet public high school in Brooklyn that was very progressive. um, it was based on John Dewey theory. It was John Dewey High School is what it was called, and it was a non-graded situation where things were done independently. And so, like, I graduated when I was 16 from high school because I had amassed enough credits to be done, but right before I turned 17. And so, the self determination to achieve was a big part of that high school. And so I think that helps when you're trying to navigate college, being a first generation college student.
When was it that you kind of knew you wanted to pursue education? Was it before you started college, or did you discover that along the way?
It's funny because I look back at school was always a good experience for me. I was a pretty good student.
Okay.
There were the same troubles that people have in school. Don't get me wrong, but
Hmm.
school in general was really positive. And so there was a time when I look back at, like, even in elementary school, being a teacher was a thing that was like on the radar, possibly, but I didn't pursue it initially. When I went to college, I went as an undeclared major. My parents would have loved for me to be a business major. The sisters before me had been an accounting major and a economics major, the two right before me. And so, that was a Jewish kid growing up in Brooklyn. That was a thing that parents wanted you to do, right? Go into business. And but I didn't ever bite on that for sure. I went as an undeclared major. I became a communications major, a speech communications major. And then, talk about an epiphanous moment. So I was getting ready to go into my junior year, and people would ask me, with a communications degree, like, what are you going to do with that? And I had this real vague, like, I don't know, about public relations, I don't know, like something in communication, but I didn't really have certainly it wasn't career based for me. And so, I was getting ready to pre-register for communications classes for my junior year. And I was standing in line. I always talk about this moment because it was real seminal in my, my upbringing. I was standing in line to get, to pre-register for courses, and they opened the door to the room to pre-register, and something struck me. And I still can't,
Hmm.
describe exactly what it was, but I stepped out of that line and walked over to the education department and changed my major, like, not ever having certainly verbalized, like, this is something I want to do. I'm sure it was there. And so, like, it was always there, I guess, in the undercurrent, but it was never something that I went knowing that I was going to do. And man, I switched to education as a major and just got all into it. I was, I wanted to still graduate, in 4 years, and so I doubled up a lot of classes. I took, a 24-hour semester one year, one of the times, just to be able to catch up. And but I also got the best grades I had ever gotten, because suddenly there was a purpose to it. And so, when you have purpose, right, when you have more to do, you get more done. And when you have a purpose, you get more done.
Yeah.
And suddenly I had this purpose, and I got it done. I finished and graduated with my class, even though changing majors late, and to a whole different thing. It just worked out for me. And I had a teacher when I was in junior high, the teacher that was the most impactful to me. She was my seventh grade Spanish teacher. And so I became like in love with learning language and taking language. And so starting in seventh grade, I took Spanish all the way through to sophomore year of college. I had also taken 2 years of French in high school. I took Spanish and French at the same time. And so after my second year teaching, I became a bilingual teacher for a year. And that was and when you talk about the influence of people, she, and luckily, as I was in my career and social media became a thing, I was able to connect with her and tell her, this is I became a bilingual teacher because of something you did. And so I was a bilingual teacher for a year. And yeah, it was I mean, just all kinds of positive, mostly, almost, I stayed 40 years, Beth. So there had to be positivity in that. People don't stick with a career as long as I did and hate it. Hopefully they don't. And so it was a lot of loving what I did, for sure.
Hmm. What did you do on those hard days, or maybe those hard years, when you found yourself thinking like, is this still worth it? What were the things that you would do or tell yourself to remind yourself like, yeah, it is still worth it?
And how you phrase that question is exactly right, because you do have to
Mm.
tell yourself that. You do have to remind yourself,
Mm-hmm.
because it's so easy to get caught up in tornadoes of negativity. As a leader who has helped other leaders, I've told people, if you'll find tornadoes of negativity, and if you allow yourself to get caught up in that vortex, and nobody's got their feet on the ground. And so, kind of early, I realized that yes, there are definitely, bad days, bad weeks, bad years, but in reality, nothing is all great or all bad. And so when you um, specifically and intentionally look for and remind yourself, you know what, yes, this is bad. What will the impact of this be in 5 minutes, 5 hours, 5 days, 5 months, 5 years, right? It's a lot easier to bring yourself back to the fact that most difficulties are transient, they're temporary, and that really the good way I mean, like, so far outweighs the bad when you're doing something that you enjoy doing and that you're good at. So it was just about being intentionally aware that things are not permanent, and that bad things are not permanent, and that you can, and that you draw on the all the good experiences. I'll give you an example of this. So as a teacher, I taught for 7 years in the classroom. I was an elementary teacher, and I taught first grade, I taught fourth grade, I taught fifth grade, and I taught a bilingual as well. And one of the things that I wanted to create in my classroom was that for kids, so that yes, there are going to be struggles, there are going to be times when things, are not easy. There are going to be times when you're not getting along with people. Even me, you may not be getting along with me. I may not be getting along with you. Like those things happen. But but what I tried to do intentionally as a teacher and then as a teacher leader was to provide enough positive experiences that the negative didn't you know cause collapse, that you could that there was kind of a strength in a base that existed. Like at my students, I would tell them, I love you, right? I love you, I care about you, I need for you, I want you to do the best that you can. And then when we had, and I deliberately did a lot of things to show them that I cared about them, that I loved them, that I wanted them to do well, so that when difficult things happen, you can you had that base of, all right, I have support, I have love, I have, you know, many, many good experiences, that this bad experience is not going to dilute all that good.
Talk to me about, as you're in the classroom for these 7 years, at what point did you kind of feel like you might want to transition into administration?
So I'm going to tell you that that happened actually in my first year of teaching. Not it wasn't as specific as that, but I started teaching at a school in Houston that as a first grade teacher, and I was on a team of, I think there were five of us, maybe four other first grade teachers, and one of the teachers there had been teaching for 29 or 30 years at that time, teaching first grade at that school. So she had been there all that time. And one of the things that I thought initially was, I don't know that, and this is even just starting out my first few, my first semester there, was I like this is what I want to do, and I'm not ready to go immediately, but that I need to set myself up, because I don't know that I could do the same thing for 30, the exact same thing for 30 years. She was able to do that, and she drew, she was joyful, and she wasn't a bad model. It wasn't like that she hated her job after 30 years. She still enjoyed doing what she did, but I knew myself that that was not going to be workable for me. And so I think it was even my second semester teaching that I enrolled in a master's program at, initially at University of Houston, to start taking classes to eventually, create something that would be something else at some point. Yeah.
So when was it that you kind of got that opportunity to transition into, did you go into an AP role first for a few years?
So what I did was, after 3 years in Houston, I moved to San Antonio, and I started working in San Antonio ISD. And in my fourth year there, so my seventh year teaching, there was a an opportunity for people who had well, okay, let me back up a little bit. So at that time, the teacher appraisal process required every teacher to have two observations, two formal observations, one by their supervisor and one by what was called other appraiser. Okay, and so in San Antonio ISD at the time, elementary schools didn't have assistant principals, and so the principal was the supervisor for everybody. And so what the district did was they hired this cadre of teachers who got trained to be teacher appraisers, and then they were the other appraiser, right? And so they took them out of the classroom, they trained them in the formally in the got certified as appraisers, and then those people went around to schools and did formal appraisals. And so I was able to get chosen to be one of those people in my in after my seventh year of teaching. And so that position was, like, I can't even tell you how amazing an experience that was. In a year and a half, I did 450 formal appraisals from elementary to middle school, so pre-K to eighth grade. and had this amazing experience. What I would do is I would go to a school. I would, be assigned there for a couple of weeks. I would do all the formal appraisals and then kind of move on to the next school, to the next school, to the next school. And so the intense amount of instruction, both phenomenal and terrible, that I got to see in those, in that really short period of time was transformational. I mean, that's nobody
Yeah, how
gets to do that,
fascinating.
and nobody gets to do and
Right.
get paid for it. I mean, it was
Yeah.
it was a phenomenal job. It was a phenomenal job. And what at that time San
Hmm.
Antonio ISD often chose for that position people who were interested in administration. And so what ended up happening was, I was in my second year in that position, but the school that I had actually taught at, that my wife was still teaching at, we met, teaching that, and we taught together. She needed an assistant principal, and so about December of that second year, she that principal chose me as an assistant principal. So I did that for a year and a half, and then I became an assistant principal after that. But having left and come back, the amount of instructional knowledge that I had was just, I mean, it was phenomenal. It was just incredible. Um, Things that I had seen and then could work into, this is, I've seen different ways of doing things, different, methods of organization, and of social emotional, and just all of those things. And then I could be a much better resource to teachers than when I went back, because I had seen so much. Yeah.
Right. So I want to hear a little bit about your first few years as an administrator. What did you learn? What was that transition like into a leadership position? And I'd love to hear some more of how you used all of that experience to help coach your teachers.
Yeah. So initially, so for that year and a half, I had done the appraisals for a year and a half, and then I was assistant principal at the
Hmm.
school that I had taught at for a year and a half. And
Right.
what's funny is my wife still worked there. So I actually went back and I was the assistant
Hmm.
principal at the school she taught at. Also, the guy that had been
Hmm.
the best man at my wedding taught there, and yeah, it was like, but
Okay.
yeah, but it was a great assistant principal situation, but it wasn't a realistic one, because you don't usually get to go back to the place where you've been, you know kind of nurtured and and all that, and you had friends there, and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
all that. So,
Hmm.
but I will tell you that, being as young as I was 29, I think 28 or 29 when I left the classroom. And then here I am now. I've been an appraiser for 28, right? So then I was 31 at the end of my second year as assistant principal, actually a year and a half as assistant principal at the school that I worked at. And I was 31, and luckily, when you're 31, you know everything, right? You you have there's a supreme confidence that comes with being 31 in an administrative role, because you already know everything. And I yeah and so I back in that time, this was in 1993, not internet job searches or anything like that. You look for jobs in the newspaper, and there was a little ad for a principal position in a small rural suburban, but at that time mostly rural district, right outside San Antonio, about 15 minutes outside of town. And it was for a pre-K through 2 elementary school, with 475 kids. And I applied for it, and short version of the story is I got that job. And so here I was, 31, and I was named, principal at this little school. And I was coming in with all kinds of confidence, and I already knew everything. And remember, all my experience up to then, I'd grown up in Brooklyn. I worked in Houston ISD in the city, and I worked in San Antonio ISD in the city. And so I was going to this mostly rural district, knowing everything. And and my first, what I learned was how to make mistakes, and then get myself straight. So, I went in with all these ideas of, this is what needs to be done. Like we have to. I met with the secretary. I got hired in July, and the teachers weren't back, and the secretary agreed to meet me up at school and show me some things. And you know, I had all these ideas that we're going to start, we're going to hit it hard and make all these changes and all that. And what I learned was that that was a spectacularly terrible idea. But I
Sure.
went in and I did it anyway. Don't get me wrong. I was 31 and I did it anyway. It wasn't like I had a moment before it happened. It was because it happened that I had a moment. So I go in, I make these changes. The guy that I replaced had been there for 15 years. He was local. Um, there were some serious issues with school performance in the school and in the district. Though it was a primary school, there was some like TEA in the Texas Education Associate, or yeah, Texas Education Agency, intervention. Which I didn't know before I was hired, but the superintendent was new. She was hired to kind of make some changes, and then I was her first hire. So and we didn't know each other. It was just kind of out of the blue. But what I found is there were a few people that were very, just like you'll find anywhere. There were a few people that were ready for change. They wanted change, and they were in my corner right from the beginning. Right, they wanted somebody to come in and fix what they appeared to. And then there were a significant number of people who were ambivalent, and there was a significant number of people who didn't, thought things were just fine the way they were. This is no surprise to anybody, except it was a surprise to it was a surprise to me at the time, because I just assumed everybody would know that I was coming in with great intention and with
Yeah.
wanting to
All this
improve.
experience and
Yes,
all these,
yes, all these great
yeah.
ideas from the city, and it did not go over great. So initially, there was a there was a survey done, I want to say about mid-year, and and I was floored by the negative comments on that survey, because I'll tell you this, Beth. I went in with a positive. I didn't think that people there were doing anything terribly wrong. I was a teacher. I was coming in still, with the heart of a teacher. Still have a heart of a teacher, hopefully. And it was not that I was going in saying, y'all are doing everything wrong. Here's the right way to do it. It wasn't that. It was here's a better way to do what we're doing. And I made the mistake that leaders make all the time, which is I was thinking about 5 steps ahead of where people were, in practice. And I was trying to get them to that place 5 steps ahead where I was, and without considering the interim steps to get there. And so, because I was just going to go in and we're just going to fix it. I mean, like, we have to fix this. Let's just fix it, right? and and
Right.
so and
Right.
so the survey that year, and I used to keep a copy of that survey in my desk for years after that,
Hmm.
just as a
And this
reminder.
was a survey like that the teachers had
Oh
responded
yeah,
to?
oh yeah, and we're saying,
Okay.
new principal is not an improvement, and like there were comments that were, just telling all the things that I didn't give the survey. It was like either the district did, probably because they were required by TEA, but it was, but the survey did not go very well. And but what it
Mm.
did for me was say, okay, idiot, like, stop stop trying
Yeah.
to force change before setting up the stage for change to be able to happen. And so the focus for me just changed completely to that. Because you know what, this is how I felt. Like, I was initially hurt. I'm a human, like, I was hurt by the comments. I was
Right,
I
of
was mad. I
course.
was mad about them. I went through all
Yeah.
the stages of the Kubler-Ross, stages of grief kind of stuff. I
Yeah,
was like,
grief,
yeah,
yeah.
I but what I realized was, initially I was thinking, I'm fretting about this. I'm like, not sleeping and whatever, and they're sleeping fine, right? The people who wrote the stuff were fine. So I had to initially get to that point where I'm saying, okay, this is not necessarily personal to me. It's not me they don't care for specific. I mean, there may be people who didn't care for me, specifically, but it was really my way that was causing there to be an issue, and I can fix that. I can fix the approach, and I needed to fix the approach. That approach is not. Yeah, I've seen that mistake. My mistake has happened so many times to so many people that didn't need to happen, because if you see that the approach and that the taking those steps, but of course I didn't know that at the time, and nobody had coached me to that. Nobody had coached me there, because I had been as an assistant principal, I was working with my friends and my wife and my, like that, and everybody was fine, right? um, and so now, on my own, trying to do this, it was a whole different thing. And so I really really learned so much from that experience, that helped me then move forward in a much, much more inclusive, a much more collaborative way, that needed to happen. And also to be a lot more patient with people who were not quite there yet, uh, in my way of thinking, or in a way of thinking that was going to solve problems rather than, perpetuate them.
Yeah, I'd love to hear. We talk about this a lot on this podcast of how a new principal can come to a new campus and fix things in a way that's respectful and honoring of the good things that they've got going for them and honoring of the past, while also, especially if there's a growth plan or something like that in place, where it's like also change doesn't have to be bad. So, what are some specific things that you changed about your approach that you feel like started to work better?
The first thing that I did, that I consciously did, was to really dig into what the culture was of the school when I got there, and to not be adversarial to that culture, to find, just like I was talking about my classroom, um, to find what the positive things were in the culture, to find, where the levers were, who the people were that were influential, and just what things were sacred and shouldn't be changed in a way that is heavy hitting. Um, and so really a lot of it was that it was taking a step back. When I stayed at that school for 5 years, and when I was looking for a position to move, I could say this is, specifically what I learned. Um, I interviewed for a position, um, and I was asked, what would you do in the first 90 days? That's a kind of a typical question, right? And what I learned was 5 years later, that when I interviewed for this position, was my answer was nothing. What I would change is nothing in my first 90 days. I would not have said that in my first interview, five years earlier. What I said was just what I'm saying to you now, is what I would do in the first 90 days is use, my two eyes and my two ears rather than my one mouth, and listen to, and see twice as much as I said, to find out what was really kind of going on there, before starting to find a place, an opening, where change could be
Hmm.
done in a way that we knew would be successful.
I want to talk a little bit about that shifting from a deficit mindset. You kind of mentioned that earlier, of not focusing on just what's wrong or what's bad. I want you to talk to me about why that's important to you and how you've seen that deficit mindset in education, so we kind of understand what we're talking about.
Right. So remember, I started teaching as a first grade teacher, and I worked at that first school I was principal at was pre-K through two. Eventually, in the 5 years I was there, we added third grade, but it was all little kids. Like it was all little kids. When I left, there were 845, I think, pre-K through three kids. So a lot of little kids. So and you know what and I had little kids at that time. when I got hired at that school, I had a 2-year old and a 6-month old, right? And what I realized was kids were leaving homes where they were treasured for the most part, where they everything they did was cute. Every approximation of a word was celebrated. If when kids were learning how to, and this is for a majority, like a great majority. There are kids that have tough situations. Don't get me wrong, but for the most part, if when a child is learning how to talk and they say, a word incorrectly, it's not, we don't hammer at them. we we're like, yes, we're like, uh, they say something for something else and we're like, yes, that's, you're right, that's, tree. If they say fee, like we're like, if they say look at the fee, we're like, yes, look at the tree. And we build on the fact that we build in them a confidence in being able to try stuff and not being, hammered at because they did it wrong. And what happens when they go to school initially is that because of the way school has been structured, for lack of a better word, is, all of a sudden there are these, what I'll call arbitrary, like when you're 4, you're supposed to be able to do this. When you're 5, you should be able to do this. But, what was initially meant in early childhood research as, uh, kind of benchmark suggestions became like, uh, you know, benchmark, like you have to meet them or you're not, you're a problem. So what 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 happens in school a lot of times when that's the focus, even in as early as pre-K and K, kids will come in and they are, coming off of being allowed to make mistakes, and their approximations are good verbally and, physically, and they learn how to take turns and share and all those kinds of things. But we work them through it. All of a sudden that now becomes a mark on a report card that says you are not, you don't know enough letters, you don't know enough sounds, you don't know enough words, you don't know how to stand in a line, you don't know how to sit on a carpet, you don't know how to share blocks, you don't know. And what we report to parents eventually, but to kids initially, is you're not doing that right. Like, not, yes, you're saying this letter, my gosh, this many letters. It's like, wow, you don't know 10 of your letters. You don't know, 15 of your sounds. You don't know this many numbers. And then we start reporting it that way to parents. We start saying, well, this is where your child is, weak. This is where your child needs help. And I'll say this, there has been conscious effort to change that, but I don't know that we do a great job of reporting the good. Like they'll always say, right, start with something positive, um, put your concern in, and then end with something positive, right? The positive sandwich, right? When you're having a conference, but really, a lot of people, I've seen teachers do this, not because they're bad people, not because they want, to create a problem for kids or parents, but the positive stuff is not as enthusiastically reported as the deficits. Like, we get right to deficits. But when I started teaching in 1983, there were not state tests yet. And so, we hadn't started doing the No Child Left Behind, any of that kind of stuff. So it was, there were certainly expectations for kids, but but approximations to that were okay. So, I talk about my first couple of years. My first 2 years was before class size limits in Texas. It was before, it was before conference periods. It was before a duty free lunch, right? But I had 31 kids my first year in first grade and 34 my second year in first grade, and no conference period, and we had to be on, we had to eat lunch with them as well. It was, but it was doable because while there were expectations, we were on a more, I feel like, a more sane timeline to get to those expectations. Like every kid was expected to, at the end of first grade, be able to read the first grade level books, right? But there was time to develop that. If they there wasn't a focus on what they, what they couldn't do. There was a focus on, come on, you all can do this. Let's get to, let's build your skills so that we can get to a place. Testing changed that in a lot of ways, because then there was this hard line of, if you don't do this, then something bad happens to you, to your school. It embarrasses your parents. It gets reported in the newspaper, and people start thinking that the local public school is not doing a good job. There's so much, there was so much of that that got into it. And what I believe is that started us as a system on focusing on deficits, because what ended up happening later was, principals would get a stack of test scores from the end of the year state test, and the first thing they look at is who didn't pass, who didn't master, who didn't move up a level. And you start focus, that becomes where your mind is at. Not eventually you look at, oh, these kids grew, and this kid, um, who hadn't passed, now suddenly was passing. But we started putting so much stock into that, that our whole system became focused on fixing deficits rather than
Right.
intensifying strengths. We start.
Well, because we as the teachers and administrators are more afraid of the sticks than we are rewarded by the carrots.
Absolutely,
Like
absolutely.
nothing's really gonna happen to you if your test scores are
Right,
stellar, but something's gonna happen if they're
right.
terrible.
That's exactly right. And all of the,
Yeah.
and when I say all of the, I mean, I really don't even say that with hyperbole. It's all of the additional funding, all of the additional support, all of that goes to kids who are, quote unquote, not, they're in need of tutoring, and they're in need of, it's very easy to cut um, gifted and talented programs, arts programs, like library programs, when if the budget requires you to put money towards remediation. But I feel like that's kind of flipped the wrong way. It's flipped the wrong, rather than living in the, in the remediation space, we should be living in the positive space.
How can principals do that when they're kind of confined in the system that doesn't do that? What can our administrators do to, at least on their campus and with their language and their teachers, kind of try to shift that mindset towards being, focused on the strengths rather than just the deficits?
So one of the ways, I feel like where that starts is in school culture. If when that becomes the school culture. So one of the things that it occurred to me late, because now I'm not there anymore, in a school. But so it occurred to me really late. It was at the conference where you and I eventually got connected through uh, through Tommy. And so I was thinking about, I was at that conference, and I was presenting a session on nurturing a culture that promotes teacher retention. Right? How do you make your school a place that people want to be? And one of the things I was talking about is that at our school we had adopted this just three easy word saying, you belong here, right? So I said, and I'm saying it that way, and now I'm going to tell you how that's evolved in my head. So what we were trying to provide at our school, we were saying, this is a good public school that where good things happen, and sometimes bad things happen, don't get me wrong, but mostly this is a good school. So how do we promote the culture here so that people know that this is a good school and a good place for kids to come and people to work, and for parents to feel comfortable leaving their kids? And so we had come up right pre-pandemic, like literally right pre-pandemic, we had come up with this idea, this kind of a broad, you belong here. And the idea was we were going to create a culture where there was something for everyone at some point. Not all the time. We can't be everything to everybody all the time. But what we wanted to create was opportunities, and this is students, staff, families, to connect at some point with the school, so that when something was going on that was maybe not as connective, it was not, oh, this school doesn't connect with me. It's like they don't, this particular activity, event, whatever, may not connect, but I know that something is coming up, that I will connect with. So so the purposeful thinking about what makes people want to come to a place, and that is when something, who they are or what they do, what they're good at, is honored, right? And so we started talking about providing opportunities in during the school day for kids to have something to look forward to. So if you're, academic, um, there's something for you. If you're artistic, if you're musical, if you're athletic, if you're, a thinker, if you're a reader, if you're whatever. And so that at some point in the school there would be something, and therefore, because it's an elementary school, someone to connect to, that that meets your needs. And so the idea was, you belong here. There's something for you here. There's something for you at the school I was at, Salinas Elementary. You belong here at Salinas. And and so
Mm-hmm.
what we had initially planned, which then got, literally was supposed to start right after spring break of 2020, which never happened,
Yep.
which never happened, was we were going to start a pilot program with first graders, where we were going to have like an in the day club period, and teachers were going to use
Mm.
their, we had a teacher who was into yoga, who was going to teach yoga, and we were going to do, athletic things, and things, for kids who were into technology. And we had bought all this stuff, and then of course that didn't happen. And but the idea kept on. And so what we did specifically this past year, because we were now second year past the COVID shutdown, but kids were still not, like, we realized we had a bunch of kids that had never been on a field trip, because no field trips in 20, no field trips in 21. And so all of a sudden we had kids that had never been anywhere. And 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 what we were, when people
Almost fourth
right,
grader.
so right, so when people talk
Mm-hmm.
about learning loss, which is really kind of a misconstrued and probably misworded phrase. They didn't really lose learning. They didn't have it to begin with. They didn't have the opportunities to begin with. They didn't lose something they had. They lost maybe the opportunity to do things. Is we That was the idea, was we need to provide, so, like, if you're a reading person, to provide schema so that kids could then connect things, experiences, with things they read, and all that. And we know that that's something that's specifically helpful, right? And so what we did this year specifically, and I had a PTO that was very that became very involved. And what I told them was, I want to provide an activity every month that is for kids and or families, that create an experience that they have maybe not had before. So, for example, we did a in September of 22, we did a back to school bash, and we had vendors, and we had one of those foam, um, the thing that spit out foam, that the foam gets 3 feet high, and
Oh
we
yeah.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
and we had
Yeah.
some guy come dressed as, one of the, like, robot from, we specifically provided music, we provided stuff for families to engage with each other, and kids to have an experience. Then in October, for Indigenous Peoples Days, we had, the Kickapoo tribe, down here in Southwest Texas, is
Mm.
is a thing. And a guy came, and he
Mm-hmm.
brought um, artifacts, and a teepee that was,
Mm.
traditional, and he talked to the kids about traditional things. In
Wow.
November,
Yeah.
we had this great plan that got rained out, and we had to change it. But we have a playground behind our school that's up on a hill, and we were going to do s'mores on the hill. Kids, we were going to give the kids the opportunity to make s'mores and sit
Mm.
outside by fires and read stories and whatever. We ended up having to move it to an indoor thing. The weather didn't cooperate, but we made s'mores for all the kids. in as a thing, and then gave them the opportunity to experience that all together. And there were things throughout the year that were provided to deliberately provide schema. I called it first Friday. We did it. We tried to schedule it the first Friday of every month. And then what had occurred to me when I was doing that presentation was that the words in "You Belong Here" were the most meaningful. And so this is now going back to what you originally asked, which is, when we look at "You Belong Here," if you the idea of it is you belong here. Put the emphasis on you, right? So we're talking about our kids, our teachers, our staff, our families. You belong here, and then you belong here. Like belong is if you put the emphasis there, belonging is something that we want you to connect with our school, because the school that I was at was not, some schools have the benefit of being the school for a town, the school for a neighborhood, whatever. We were not in a neighborhood specifically. We drew kids from a bunch of different neighborhoods, not from any particular, geographic. So there was not a connection that we had to create, Salinas as a place where you belong, and then you belong here. So you put the emphasis on here, that like this is the place um, where you belong. Like when you see the building, when you walk into the building, here is the place. So we were talking about who the people were, belong being the operative word, and then here the place being the place. And so when you think of it that way, there is a lot of power to that, a lot of power to those three words. If you can create a place where you belong here, and you belong here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I love it. How was that received by the community? I'd love to hear just stories of how those events went with your students and your staff. you know, was it still, I mean, I've been the president of our PTA at our school for a few years, and so every time we put on a new thing, it's like all the stress, and then it's always great. So, what was that like leading that initiative? Finally getting to see it, exist after having planned it for so long.
It was so incredibly well received, certainly by the community. The community loved it. Now we were, our district was is a um, in one way an open enrollment, our district and our school, right? So people can choose. If you live in our school district, there are 20 elementaries, and you're allowed to choose, with space available, to go to whichever school you want to. And our district is also open to students who are outside the district. And so if you live in a neighboring district or anywhere, and you want your child to go there, we accept those transfers in. And our school had between, I think it was just right under 200 kids that were not in our zone. I think it was like in the 180s or something like that, of people who chose to come to that school. And so much of it was because of that focus. People would say that, like I'll choose to go to that school because that school, not only meets our needs academically, but certainly socially, and provides an experience for our kids that we want. So, um, uh, it's the work is incredible, and I put that all on my volunteers, the PTO, and it was not a whole ton of people that did it. As
Yeah.
as a PTO mom yourself,
Oh
it's
yeah.
not, yeah, it's not, you have these grand plans, and then people. But what it took was, I will say this: I had a PTO president who also worked at that school, and whose kids went there, and she was great at getting community partners to volunteer, to donate, to participate in events.
Mm,
Like we had food trucks at events because she called people and said,
yeah,
bring your food
right.
truck. Or we had vendors at events because or like, we're having this activity and I need cookies donated so the kids could decorate it. We did a holiday thing in December, and we need, and people would do it. So, because really the big part, as you know, is asking. Like if you people
Right.
don't just
Yep.
come to you, they don't just
100%.
show up. But if you ask, people will typically do something. And if you were to see the poster that we had up of our sponsors for the year for different things, there were dozens of people who did a little bit, because you don't need one person to do it all. You need a bunch of people to do a little bit. And that's what that's kind of how that was. And that also brought in the greater community of people who then also got a positive image of our school because they had volunteered, because they had donated stuff, and they were like, "Oh, this is a good school because they do things to create an experience for kids." Yeah.
Man, that's awesome. Ugh, and that gives me, this time in the year is always that like, okay, like I don't want to do it anymore. Like, it's just I'm finished the year out well and thinking about the next year. And so it's just good to remember like why we do this and what a difference it actually can make. And that's what we want to do is like make that difference. Yeah.
One of my big uh, focuses is on teacher retention. I'm
Mm-hmm.
writing a book on that that's going to be published at some point. And one of the things that I can say about our school, because in these times, teachers don't stay in places, so certainly in places that they don't want to be. And it's not all money. We can't control money, and we can't control, you know, um, state mandates and all that kind of stuff, but we can control the culture in our building, in our community. And so I had, when I left a couple of weeks ago, out of a staff of 90, I had three people who left. Two of them moved out of town, one out of state, one to Rockport, and then only one who switched districts fairly locally, though it was still a little bit closer to her home. So people did, buy into the fact that they were working in a culture where it was, where their needs were honored. And so there a lot went into that as well, creating a place where teachers could teach and kids could learn and families could be connected. um, that's not something that happens overnight. And going back to something we talked about earlier, when you talk about lessons learned, is I've been a longevity guy. So I was at that school for 8 years. I was at the school previous to that for 13 years, right? So the last two schools I've been at, 21 of my 25 years in the district have been just at two schools. And those cultures develop over time. They're not, you, people want to go in and change culture quickly to make quick gains. And there are some things you can do quickly to make quick changes, like to make quick improvements, but culture building takes time, and you have to be willing to kind of be all in where you're at at the time, and not be like ready to go to the next thing already, and be able to commit time to developing a culture, because it doesn't get to that point, in your first year.
That's good to remember. We're kind of coming up on time. I can't believe it. It's been almost an hour. But before we go, I would love to ask just, what would you say to a new principal who has maybe been in the role for a year or two? Or what would you say to Marty when you were in that space? Like what kind of words would you like to leave us with today?
One of the best pieces of advice that I have been given and I give, there are actually two quotes that I've given to, and I will tell you that one of the things I'm proud of, Beth, is that every assistant principal that I had that wanted to be a principal became one. Like I had 100% success in people who wanted to become principals becoming them. And so I'm gonna say that a lot of that is circumstance, but what I feel like I gave to them, which is what I would want somebody to have said to me, and is two different things. One of them is, going back to the experience that I told you that I learned from, is make haste slowly, right? That's I've printed that out for people to keep in their desk or on their thing. Make haste. You have to do it, but you have to do it slowly. Uh, Change doesn't come in big dramatic sweeps. It comes in really small bits. I talk about the example I like to give is sometimes a tsunami is a big wave that comes dramatically, like on TV and in movies. You'll see this big, wave that's as big as a building come in, but really, right. But really, the other way that probably more likely comes in is that the tide gets higher, but it doesn't recede, and then it gets higher, and it doesn't recede, and it gets higher, and it doesn't recede, and that's really the tsunami that educators, leaders need to try to work for, not the big crashing wave that destroys, but but improving a little, and then not falling back, and then improving a little bit more, and not falling back and improving a little bit more. And that also is more humanly possible than creating bunches of big waves. Bunches of big waves, right? So that's more sustainable. And the other one is, just the basic, people want to be seen, valued, and heard. uh, Staff wants to be seen, valued, and heard. Kids want to be seen, valued, and heard. Families want to be seen, valued, and heard. And so what you have to do there is to give, not, you have to be able to not be your community, not be your staff. You have to be you. You have to be you in the position that you're in, but you have to be able to accept and honor and uh, for lack of a better word, work with people who think differently, look differently, act differently than you, and kind of take, again, not looking at deficit, because when you look at what is if you work in inner city like I have a lot of my career, the people who come in, our families who come in, may not look like me. They may not uh, act like me. They may not dress like me. They may, whatever. They're not my age. But when we, if we start to look at all the things that are different between us, that's easy to find too. But if we look at the things that are the same about us, where, humans, where we care about the kids, the kid, we're connected to the school, where, there's so many things that where we can start on a place where we have things in common. And when you find those first, you're in a much better position. So the advice I would give is to find the commonalities before you find the differences.
Mm-hmm. That's so good. Marty, it's been so great chatting with you. Is there anywhere on social media or online where folks can connect with you if they'd like to?
Absolutely. I would love to, now that I'm retired, I told people at that
Mm.
conference, like, connect with me because I don't have anything
Mm-hmm.
else to do now. So, so I love to be connected. Hope to still stay
mm.
in the education realm at some point in some capacity, for sure. But I'm on Twitter at Mr. Silverman 116. Is my Twitter handle, and I would love to. I tend to Twitter doom scroll, and so I'd love to see some positivity on my Twitter feed. So definitely connect with me and bring some positivity to that. I'm on Facebook as myself, and that's uh, has been school stuff and family stuff. You can see my cute grandkids. I'm on Instagram, the Five Silvermans, but that's more. I've kind of devoted that to my hobby of cooking, and so there's just pictures of food on there mostly. It's not educational content. I'm on LinkedIn as well, under my name, and so definitely connect. And uh, love to have dialogues about education, and look forward to being connected to people. Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It was so great chatting with
Well,
you.
same here, Beth. Thank you so much for the connection and reaching out, and I've been looking forward to this. It's been just an absolute pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much. Hopefully, we'll get to do it again soon.
Yes.
Maybe when your book comes out.
Yes.
That'd be great. Thanks. What a great conversation. Marty, again, thank you so much for joining me that day. It was so fun to talk with you and hear all your stories. In fact, after the episode, I think Marty and I kept talking about principals and PTA and schools and resourcing our administrators for another 20 or 30 minutes after that. He just has so much experience, and I love the way that he's vulnerable and willing to share what he learned from failure and struggle along with what he's learned from his success. And he's such a fun guy to work with. So, Marty, again, thank you so much. As always, this podcast is produced and edited by Erwin Solbach. Our logo design was from Alana Kanoy at Steel Consulting, and this whole production is brought to you by Responsive Learning. As always, you can find all of the resources mentioned linked in our show notes. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks for listening.